Welcome back to the Chong channel. So today we're looking at factoring by grouping. So I'm going to demonstrate two examples. So once again, whenever you're dealing with a factoring question, the first question you should always ask yourself is this an X factor? But if you remember from the other videos, X factor, you have to have a coefficient of 1. So this doesn't, so this is not X factor. So the next question you ask yourself is this a difference? Well, that is a difference, but is 3 a perfect square, 2, or 5? No. So the next question you ask yourself is this GCF? Well, 3, 2, and 5 do not have a common factor. So when all fails, X factor, difference of perfect squares, GCF, then that means we need to do this thing we call factor by grouping. So factor by grouping is when you're dealing with a coefficient that's not 1. You multiply the first coefficient times the last term. And so the first coefficient times the last term is negative 15. Then you have this middle term, so the middle coefficient goes on the bottom, just like we did in other X factor questions. So you ignore the sign in front, forget the sign, just focus on the 15, and we're going to list the factors starting from 1. So we have 1 and 15, 2 does not work, 3 works, 3 and 5, 4 doesn't work, and we have 5, and the list continues to the top. That's how you know you're done with your list. So now let's plug in which of these factors will add or subtract to give you the 2. And so the only choice would be 3 and 5. So let me circle 3 and 5. So I put 3 and I put 5. Now this bottom represents sum. Now sum follows the sign of the larger number. Sum is like little brother. So let's look at 3 and 5. Which of these is the bigger number? And it's 5. And so little brother sum follows the sign of big brother, 5. Now always check that your numbers work out. So 3 times negative 5, is that negative 15? Yes. 3 plus negative 5, is that negative 2? Yes. So it works out. Now remember, the coefficient was not 1, so that means this is not good. So each of these now represent the coefficient of the variable. So the variable in this problem is p, so we're going to put positive 3p. And for this part, we're going to have negative 5p. So here, when you're dealing with factoring by grouping, we're going to rewrite the expression first term first, last term last, and then space, space. So how do you know which of these you put in these spaces? Well, one thing you need to remember, the terms next to each other have to have a GCF. They have to have a common factor. So if you look here, 3 works better with 3 here, and 5 works better with 5 here. So that tells us how to set it up. So let's put positive 3p here, and let's put negative 5p here. Now, factoring by grouping, you end up with this algebraic expression, but it's really 2 GCF questions. Imagine there's an imaginary line here separating it into 2 GCF questions. So now, between 3 and 3, what's a common factor? 3. P squared and P, what's a common factor? P. So our GCF for these two terms is 3p. Now we're going to do the distributive property. And so 3p times what term is 3p squared? Well, I already have the 3. I have a p, but I want p squared, so I need one more p. So let's put p. So 3p times p is 3p squared. And 3p times what term is positive 3p? Well, I already have 3p, so that means I have to multiply by 1. 3p times 1 is 3p. Now, factoring by grouping, we're looking for the group that they have in common. So in this case here, p plus 1 is going to be that group. Group means a lot of stuff, and that has a lot of stuff going on here. So what we're going to do is rewrite that group onto the right. And the group was p plus 1. So I'm going to rewrite that here, p plus 1. Now we're going to do the distributive property, but in reverse. So p times what term gives you negative 5p? So that's negative 5. Negative 5 times p is negative 5p, and negative 5 times 1 is negative 5. So here, our group is p plus 1, and that group hung out with two terms. What's the first term it hung out with? 3p, and it also hung out with negative 5. So as you see here, p plus 1, it hung out with 3p, and it hung out with negative 5. So this is the two factors that multiply to give us our original problem. All right, so let's look at another example. So once again, we're doing this by grouping because the coefficient was not 1. So going through the list, this was not X factor, this was not difference of perfect squares, this was not GCF. So that means we're going to use factoring by grouping. We're going to multiply the first coefficient times the last coefficient. So first times last, that's negative 18. So that's our product. Then we have the middle coefficient, which is positive 3. That represents sum. So do not look at the sign here. We're just going to focus on 18, and we're listing all the numbers starting from 1. So that would be 1 times 18, 2 times 9, 3 times 6, 4 doesn't work, 5 doesn't work, and we have 6, then the list continues above. So that's how we know we're done. Now we got to figure out which of these pairs will add or subtract to give you that 3. Well, the only choice would be 3 and 6. So let's put 3 and 6. Sum is like little brother, and little brother follows the sign of big brother. So which of these numbers is bigger? It's 6. So sum is positive, so the big number is positive. But once again, these two have to multiply to give you negative. So then that means 3 is negative. When the coefficient is not 1, this is not good, then that means we have more work. Each of these numbers now represents the coefficient of the variable in the problem. The variable in the problem here is n, so that means this is negative 3n and this is positive 6n. So factoring by grouping, we're going to rewrite our expression as first term first. So first term first, last term last. So now let's put here negative 9, and we have space, space. Now, what goes in these spaces? What you got from your X factor. And so you have to remember the terms next to each other have to have a common factor. So what would go better with 2? Would it be the 3 or the 6? 6. Very good choice. So now let's put positive 6n. And what goes better with the 9? The negative 3n. So if we do factoring by grouping, we essentially have 2 GCF questions. So I'm going to circle the first one in yellow, and then I'll circle the second GCF question in pink. Okay, so let's first attack the yellow one. Now 2 and 6, what's a common factor? 2. N squared and n, what's a common factor? N. So now we're doing the distributive property. 2n is our GCF. 2n times what term is 2n squared? Well, I already have the 2. I have an n. I want n squared, so I need another n. So 2n times what term gives you positive 6n? So I already have my n, so I need to multiply by 3. So 2n times n is 2n squared. 2n times 3 is 6n. Now remember, factoring by grouping, we want to find that group. So in this case, our group here is n plus 3. So I'm going to rewrite that group onto the right. And so I have n plus 3 on the right here. We're going to do the reverse distributive now. So n times what term gives you negative 3n? That would be negative 3. So negative 3 times n is negative 3n. Negative 3 times 3 is negative 9. So what is the group in this problem? It was n plus 3. Now n plus 3 was hanging out with 2 terms. Who was he hanging out with first? Well, he hung out with 2n. And who else did he hang out with? Well, he also hung out with minus 3. So n plus 3 is the group, and it hung out with 2 terms, 2n, and it also hung out with minus 3. So those are our 2 factors. I hope this helped. Bye-bye.